Between the 5th and 7th of December, 1941, Operation Crusader finally began to turn the relief of Tobruk from a fragile hope into a more durable fact. Contact had been made on the 27th of November, then lost 2 days later, and the reversal had shown how quickly success could vanish in the Western Desert. By early December, the battle had become a test of persistence as much as maneuver. British and Commonwealth forces were battered, armored units were depleted, and infantry formations had been pushed near exhaustion. Yet the offensive continued, and that decision mattered. The renewed link with Tobruk was not clean, sudden, or easy. It was the product of pressure maintained after the battle had already consumed much of its original strength.
The days before contact was regained had been filled with uncertainty. The corridor to Tobruk had opened and closed, and both sides understood its importance. For the British and Commonwealth Army, reopening the connection meant proving that Crusader had not merely touched Tobruk, but had actually broken the logic of the siege. For Rommel's Axis forces, keeping the corridor closed meant preserving the possibility that the fortress could still be isolated and the offensive defeated. The struggle was therefore not simply about one road or one ridge. It was about whether months of siege would end, whether the British would regain the initiative, and whether Rommel could still impose his will on a battle that was beginning to strain his own forces.
By this point, the campaign had changed character. The early British hope of a coordinated armored offensive had been battered by fights at Bir el Gubi, Sidi Rezeg, at Duda, Belhamed, and the frontier. The destruction of 5th South African Brigade and the heavy losses among British armored formations had made the cost unmistakable. Rommel's dash to the frontier had caused panic at 8th Army headquarters, and Cunningham had been replaced by Neil Ritchie under Auchinleck's direction. Yet beneath all that turmoil, the essential purpose had survived. Tobruk still had to be relieved. The army had not stopped. That continuity of purpose became one of Crusader's decisive strengths.
Contact regained was not the result of one glamorous armored charge. It came from accumulated pressure across the battlefield. The Tobruk garrison continued to push outward from inside the perimeter, while forces outside the fortress fought to reopen the ground between the siege lines and the relieving army. Infantry, artillery, anti-tank guns, engineers, transport units, and surviving armor all had roles to play. Some units were exhausted, some were under strength, and some had been reorganized under pressure, but the campaign still required them to function together. This was combined arms warfare in its most strained form, not a textbook demonstration, but a battered system trying to keep enough parts working to achieve the mission. The ground southeast of Tobruk remained the key. A corridor could not be wished into existence simply because commanders wanted one. It had to run through contested desert, shaped by ridges, tracks, defended points, and artillery observation. Any route into Tobruk had to be protected against tanks and anti-tank guns, covered by artillery where possible, and supplied through a battlefield that remained dangerous. A narrow connection could be cut by a determined counterattack or made useless by fire on its approaches. To regain contact, British and Commonwealth forces had to do more than reach the garrison. They had to make the enemy's grip on the corridor weaker than their own ability to keep it open.
For the soldiers in the Tobruk garrison, these days carried the weight of months. The defenders had endured siege since April, watched earlier relief attempts fail, and then lived through the emotional rise and fall of contact made and contact lost. By early December, renewed connection was not an abstract operational milestone. It meant the possibility of movement, relief, supply, evacuation, and the end of complete isolation. But the men inside Tobruk could not simply celebrate while the fight still raged outside. They had to keep attacking, holding, and coordinating with forces whose positions were difficult to know precisely. Relief was arriving through violence, not ceremony. For the troops outside Tobruk,
The renewed effort demanded a different kind of endurance. Many had already been through days of desert movement, air attack, artillery fire, armored clashes, and confusing orders. Tank crews had seen formations shrink under the pressure of battle. Infantry battalions had seized ground only to face counterattack or shelling. Gunners and engineers had worked under conditions where a mistake could open a flank or close a route. The 5th to 7th of December did not feel like a fresh beginning. It felt like one more demand placed on men and machines already near their limits. The fact that the effort continued was itself militarily significant.
Rommel's position was also becoming more difficult. His counterstrokes had inflicted severe damage and repeatedly threatened to wreck the offensive, but his army had not destroyed 8th Army, had not taken Tobruk, and had not restored the siege in a stable way. Axis forces were under pressure from several directions, and their own losses, fuel problems, repair burdens, and supply difficulties were mounting. Rommel could still strike hard, and no Allied commander could safely assume the danger had passed. But the balance was changing. The British and Commonwealth Army had survived the most frightening shocks of late November, while the Axis ability to keep every crisis under control was narrowing.
The renewed contact also showed the difference between tactical brilliance and operational outcome. Rommel had created repeated crises through speed, aggression, and local concentration. He had punished British armor, shattered exposed formations, and nearly convinced his opponents that the offensive should be abandoned. Yet Crusader's larger purpose survived because the British command did not quit when the battle looked worst. Auchinleck's insistence on continuing mattered here. It did not erase mistakes, and it did not make the campaign elegant, but it allowed pressure to continue long enough for Axis opportunities to pass and Allied opportunities to reappear. In mobile warfare, endurance can be as decisive as speed.
The armored warfare lesson is especially important. Tanks had been central to the operation, but by early December, the campaign could not be understood as a simple armored contest. The surviving tanks mattered because they could support attacks, respond to threats, and add mobile firepower where needed. But the outcome around Tobruk now depended heavily on infantry holding ground, anti-tank guns defending approaches, artillery suppressing enemy positions, engineers making routes usable, and logisticians keeping the force alive. The tank remained vital, but it was no longer a symbol of easy breakthrough. Crusader had stripped away that illusion. Armored warfare worked only when the whole military system endured.
The regained contact was therefore a battered success. It did not mean every danger disappeared, and it did not mean the Axis army had been destroyed. The corridor had to be protected, and Rommel still had forces capable of hurting the Allies badly. But the strategic meaning was unmistakable. Tobruk was no longer sealed in the same way. The siege that had begun in April was being broken in practical terms, through a connection that could finally be made and sustained. For British and Commonwealth forces, after the humiliations of Brevity and Battle Axe and the near disaster of late November, that mattered profoundly. It proved that the offensive had achieved the central thing it had been created to do.
The human cost behind that achievement should remain clear. Contact regained was not a neat redemption story in which earlier losses were somehow balanced by success. The dead at Sidi Rezeg, the destroyed South African brigade, the burned-out tanks, the exhausted New Zealand infantry, the battered garrison, and the crews lost in repeated clashes did not become less real because the corridor reopened. Military history must hold both truths at once. The operation was succeeding, and the success had been purchased at a severe price. That is one reason Crusader feels so different from a clean victory narrative. It was a hard, partial, overdue relief, won by armies that had nearly broken each other in the process.
Between the 5th and 7th of December, the campaign finally began to move toward release. Tobruk's isolation was ending. Rommel's position around the fortress was becoming unsustainable, and Eighth Army could claim that persistence through crisis had produced a real result. Yet the victory remained limited because the Axis army had not been annihilated, and the Desert War would continue. In the history of armored warfare, contact regained at Tobruk teaches that mechanized campaigns are decided not by the first breakthrough or the most dramatic raid, but by the ability to sustain pressure after chaos. Crusader had been messy, costly, and often badly handled, but in these December days it achieved its central purpose. The siege line was broken, and Tobruk was finally connected to the army fighting to save it.